Perhaps you can see the steam emerging from the White House at the moment. Reportedly, Donald Trump's response to all of this has been volcanic, nothing less. He's a man who often claims to be the victim of a witch hunt. It seems he's now presiding over one while he looks for the person who has written this op-ed. Of course, there is also considerable anger being directed by the White House at the New York Times for choosing to break with its tradition and to actually publish this editorial anonymously. I think the real difficulty for the White House is this comes so close on the heels of the lines that emerged from this Bob Woodward book, all done on deep background over the past few days. It too paints a picture of a chaotic White House with a capricious president, a White House where staff have to intervene to protect the American people from his more dangerous impulses. But what about the politics in all this? I think the really interesting question is how the response to this works out a little way down the line. Donald Trump is sending messages out to his voters saying, look, he is trying to drain the swamp, and the swamp is fighting back. If the first rule of the resistance is don't talk about the resistance, someone just broke the code in dramatic fashion.
The root of the problem is the president's amorality. Anyone who works with him knows he is not moored to any discernible first principles that guide his decision-making.
In the opinion pages of the New York Times, a current senior official in the administration writes an editorial that lifts the lid on what he or she describes as the amoral, chaotic presidency of Donald Trump.
The dilemma, which he does not fully grasp, is that many of the senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. I would know. I am one of them.
Line by line, the anonymous official delivers an ever more devastating assessment of the White House which they serve, one of the adults in the room, to curb the president's more dangerous tendencies.
It may be cold comfort in this chaotic era, but Americans should know that there are adults in the room. We fully recognise what is happening, and we are trying to do what's right, even when Donald Trump won't. The result is a two-track presidency.
It didn't take long for the president to react, flanked by a posse of sheriffs in the East Room. He was determined to correct the record, producing his own newspaper article from a suburban Washington conservative newspaper that sings his praises.
So we have more people working today than at any point ever in our history.
Then he ran through his talking points one by one in a tone both angry and bitter.
If the failing New York Times has an anonymous editorial, can you believe it? Anonymous, meaning gutless, a gutless editorial. We're doing a great job. The poll numbers are through the roof. Our poll numbers are great. And guess what? Nobody is going to come close to beating me in 2020.
Shortly after, he tweeted, does the so-called senior administration official really exist, or is it just the failing New York Times with another phony source? If the gutless anonymous person does indeed exist, the Times must, for national security purposes, turn him or her over to government at once.
And apparently yesterday there were a bunch of texts going around the White House that said, sleeper cells have woken.
On networks right and left, there began a frenetic round of who wrote it, as anchors played Guess the Author. Was it John Kelly, Chief of Staff, who denied calling his boss an idiot after he was quoted in the Bob Woodward book Fear? Dan Coates says it wasn't him, even though the Director of National Intelligence in July seemed bemused by the president's behaviour.
Okay.
Yeah. Regardless of who wrote it, the op-ed confirms for power brokers in this town what they already knew.
I just don't see any news being created by this op-ed. I think it's an awareness that all of us who are in responsible positions have had, and so another day in the life of Washington.
So why take the risk? Was whoever wrote it trying to cleanse themselves of their own role in the White House, or to act as a lodestar for a rebellion by everyday Americans?
There is a quiet resistance within the administration of people choosing to put country first. But the real difference will be made by everyday citizens rising above politics, reaching across the aisle and resolving to shed the labels in favour of a single one: Americans.
The reality is everyday Americans who voted for Donald Trump now have confirmation that the deep state of which he warned is real, that the establishment is the resistance, and that in the end they must fight and they will prevail.
Kylie Morris in Washington. Well, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by the intelligence analyst Sebastian Gorka, a former advisor to the Trump administration in 2017. It's all rather chaotic, isn't it, Mr. Gorka?
No, why would it be chaotic? You don't even know if the person who wrote this op-ed exists.
You don't believe they exist?
Given the track record of the New York Times' coverage of this administration and the number of times they've been caught peddling fake news, my first reaction is that this was driven by somebody's febrile fever dreams of radical leftism and made up by somebody in the New York Times newsroom. If it is in fact written by somebody in the government, it is clearly not a senior White House official. There is nothing in this document that smacks of anybody. I mean, the idea that they're actually asking cabinet officials is risible. It is beyond a joke. If this is somebody who works in the administration, it is a very, very low-level Obama holdover.
But it's not the only time we've had these kind of allegations about what's going on in the Trump presidency. I mean, we've just had the Bob Woodward book making very similar allegations about people restraining the president from his own worst impulses.
Yeah, and what was the reaction from people who aren't cowards to the Bob Woodward book? You have four-star generals, such as Secretary Mattis, and other members of the administration said they never, ever said the things that Bob Woodward imputed to them. He is a liar. He is a hack. Bob Woodward, when I was in the White House, Bob Woodward had zero access. This is a book written by an administration, by a person who has less access to the White House than the average U.S. citizen.
Okay,
so
but he's also...
The idea that Bob Woodward is to be substantiating this op-ed that is, again, anonymous, we don't take it seriously.
Okay, Bob Woodward is also an incredibly respected journalist and has been for many years. But this op-ed that you're talking about, it's interesting, isn't it?
Me,
just let me pick up on one point that you've made.
Like me.
The op-ed that you've been talking about, it's interesting that Donald Trump hasn't chosen to cast doubt on the author's existence, as you just have. He's called it treasonous, hasn't he?
Well, no, so have I. I've actually called it seditious. So I said there's two possible scenarios if you analyze this in the cold light of day. Number one, it's fictitious, it's fallacious, it's just a fantasy of the New York Times, which is possible. Or number two, it is written by a real person in the administration, but in my opinion, a low-level holdover, a leftover of the Obama administration. And if that is the case, that individual took an oath of office, as I did when I came into the White House, and they have committed sedition. You can look it up right now in the Oxford Dictionary. Sedition is the overt or covert attempt to undermine a legal, lawful authority or a constitutional order. This letter, the person admits, I am a member of the resistance undermining the president. That is sedition.
Okay, but he's saying he's putting his loyalty first to the country. And I have looked up seditious conspiracy and the legal terms of... Hang on, let me just finish. I have looked at the terms of the seditious conspiracy, and it's conspiring to overthrow the government. This person is actually saying that he or she is in support of the government.
Yeah, by undermining the president. I mean, this is why the letter reeks of being absolute garbage. It's rubbish. The idea that in one sentence you say, oh, I support this president, and you write his party? His party? What do you mean his party? Either you support his agenda or you don't. And then the author says, I'm a member of the resistance. Sorry? You can't work. If you worked in 10 Downing Street, and actually admitted that you are there to undermine Theresa May, you'd be committing sedition too. You don't have that option. You weren't. This person was not elected to be president. They have no authority to undermine a duly elected head of state. Okay, that's why it's sedition. Whatever they say it is, it's sedition.
What should be the repercussions then? I mean, should anyone resisting or restraining the president in this way be sacked? Because there's quite a long list of people, therefore, in the firing line.
Instantly. I mean, I'll tell you what the repercussions will be. The four-star Marine Corps legend, General Kelly, who is the chief of staff, who runs the White House in terms of everyday function, will root out this seditious individual, and he will be, or she, will be immediately, very publicly and humiliatingly fired by the president, to whom he should or she should have had their policy loyalty. That is exactly what's going to happen in the next few days.
Do you think Trump should bring back the old loyalists? I mean, people like you and Steve Bannon?
I've talked to the president since I left office.
When did
it's
you
up
last speak
to
to
him to do that if he so wishes. Steve Bannon has started his own conservative movement in Europe. He has a film coming out in 2 days' time here in the US, the War Trump. I'm very, very happy supporting the president from the outside of the building. He is too. He's told me so. So
when
it's
did you
up to
last
the
speak to
president.
him?
His prerogative. It was up. Sorry?
When did you last speak to him?
Sorry?
When did you last speak to the president?
When I was in Singapore. When I was in Singapore for the summit for North Korea, he called me right after he made the joint statement.
Do you not think that this whole, this article and what's going on in the White House now, what's going on in the administration, will make Trump more unstable, more apt to lash out?
I reject your adjective. He's not unstable. He's perhaps the most successful president in modern history. I know you're, ITN, Channel 4 are rank left-wing journalists, but look at the last 18 months. Just look at the facts. Lowest unemployment for a generation, lowest unemployment for Hispanics and Black Americans since record-keeping began. We've doubled the GDP growth from the Obama years. We've had hundreds of billions of dollars repatriated to the country thanks to tax reform. We've revitalized NATO. We've crushed ISIS in the form of its physical caliphate.
And all those successes that you mentioned, all those
using
successes,
these adjectives, using these descriptors is just another example of fake news.
And all those successes that you list are despite, not because of the president, according to this anonymous author in the New York Times. And just to clarify, we are not rank left-wing journalists. We are impartial journalists, regulated by Ofcom, which is our broadcasting watchdog.
Is this Morecambe and Wise?
If we were rank left-wing journalists, we would lose our license.
Give me a break. This is like the Morecambe and Wise Christmas special. It wasn't because of the president. The fact that he slashed 22 times, for every executive order he signed, he's rescinded 22, unleashing the American economy. The fact that now Mexico and Canada are begging to renegotiate NATO. You're going to put that on the doorstep of Obama?
Okay.
Or what?
I'm not
Tony
sure whether...
Blair?
I'm not sure,
it's just ridiculous.
Sebastian Gorka, I'm not sure whether you're Morecambe or Wise, but thank you very much for joining us.